Save China-U.S. ties. From Anchorage to San Francisco to Lima, the two sides have come a long way. Over the weekend, President Xi Jinping met with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden in Lima on the sidelines of APEC meetings in Peru. Both sides hailed the past 4 years of engagement. Xi mentioned the recent U.S. elections and drove home 4 points that will remain unchanged for China, namely China's goal of a stable, healthy and sustainable China-U.S. relationship, its commitment to mutual respect, peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation, its position of resolutely safeguarding its sovereignty, security and development interests, and its desire to carry forward the traditional friendship between the two peoples. She also said China is ready to engage in dialogue, expand cooperation and manage differences with the U.S. to ensure a smooth transition for the benefits of the peoples of both countries and beyond. How did bilateral ties evolve over the past 4 years, especially since the frosty meeting in Anchorage? How did things stabilize? Did China use the Lima meeting to send a message to President-elect Donald Trump? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. We are joined from Philadelphia, the United States, by Nissan Mahboubi, Director of the PEN Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. From Peru, Lima, by Cynthia Sanborn, Director of the Center for China and Asia-Pacific Studies at the University of Pacific, and in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. The warmest welcome to all of you. So very quickly, a very quick take on the Chinese part of what the meeting was all about. President Xi told Biden that over the past 4 years, China-U.S. relations have gone through ups and downs, but the two sides have also been engaged in dialogue and cooperation, adding the relationship has remained stable on the whole. Stable on the whole. That's China's take. And on the part of Biden, according to the White House readout, the two leaders reviewed bilateral relationship over the past 4 years and took stock of efforts to responsibly manage competitive aspects of the relationship and advance areas of cooperation since the Woodside Summit, including counter-narcotics, military-to-military communication, artificial intelligence-related risks, climate change, and people-to-people exchanges. So let me go to Nissan first. What do you think is the tone of these talks on both sides?
So in my view, the tone was remarkably warm and positive. I think what was being messaged certainly was in relation to the Biden administration shortly coming to an end. There's been a lot of, I think, productive dialogue at the leader-to-leader level, just below the leader-to-leader level in the last few years. And I think there's a general recognition that even though it is a competitive relationship and a very competitive relationship, it has stabilized in the last few years. And so I think there was a tone of general appreciation for the stabilization, even while recognizing the very competitive dimensions of the relationship.
Well, we can be joined online from Shanghai by Professor Huang Jing, Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. Distinguished Professor Huang Jing, welcome to the show. So why did China value this meeting very much, knowing that Biden is leaving the White House in a matter of weeks?
I think that first and foremost, I think China's side still sees the situation manageable. Of course, we have up and downs in the past 4 years with Biden administration, but overall the bilateral relationship is well managed. On the American side, they put forward the so-called real guards, try to manage the bilateral relationship in a kind of manageable manner. But in China, of course, China is always trying to keep the communications and dialogues. And the two supreme leaders, Xi Jinping and President Biden, met several times. This is, in my memory, third time face-to-face. And yes, the two great powers are engaged in a so-called competition, of course, initiated by the United States, But this competition is so far manageable, peaceful, and both sides realize that there is a need for cooperation in many areas, and as Xi Jinping pointed out in this meeting in Lima.
Ms. Sanborn, from the Peruvian, from the Latin America or even greater global south perspective, is that meeting of significance to you, to that part of the world? How are they looking at the messages coming out?
Well, thank you very much. As observers here in Lima, Peru, Latin America, we found it encouraging that the words were about competition and not conflict, as was said. Fair competition, highlighting clearly what areas in which there are agreement and is room for collaboration. But we felt that both of them were really speaking indirectly to Donald Trump and the incoming administration, and to some extent trying to lay groundwork in an Asia-Pacific economy setting for hopefully continuing some of these decisions.
Well, we just did a very quick timeline of the important interactions between the presidents of the two countries. For instance, their first virtual meeting took place in November 2021, and then in March 2022, they had a video call on Ukraine. In July that year, President Xi sent a message of sympathy after knowing President Biden caught COVID, and then in the same month, they had a phone call. In November that year, the two finally met in person in their current capacities in Bali. And then in November the next year, they met again in person in San Francisco, which was the last APEC meeting. And then in April earlier this year, they had a phone call with each other. Finally, in Lima, they sat down again the third time in person. It also has to be noted, unfortunately, that President Biden didn't have the occasion to visit China during his presidency so far, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. Professor Liu, how do you look at the interaction between the two presidents, and what kind of role has that played in this relationship? Is that going to happen in the next 4 years?
Well, over the last 4 years, we have noticed frequent ups and downs with fluctuation, but properly managed. So the leadership play a pivotal role in managing such sort of relationship on a stable basis in order to prevent further escalation of the tension on both sides. Because as the biggest economies in the world, and the leaders need to exercise their responsibility, and not only for their own people, but for the global benefit, particularly on the exchange of trade and other type of economic relations, despite of all these differences. So to maintain a further avenue to dialogue to whatever administration, that's also very important. I think I'm also impressed, and also I'm a part of it, in the promoting people-to-people exchange on academic level, on the cultural level. So that's something to further engage with each other. So I think neither United States or China can even afford that there's totally a breakup of such a relationship. Now with the upcoming new administration in the White House, there has been a lot of apprehensions and speculations. So I think the President Xi for this meeting is also there to leave a message to the President-elect, Donald Trump version 2, that the principles are there, and now we also have drawn the refreshed red lines, and then that's a goal for that. And they also want to identify further opportunities to collaborate, with regard to climate change, with regard to health issues. But much of the ball is in the court of the new coming administration, as how they really respond to that.
Well, it's been it's been a tumultuous 4 years, if I may say that, if we remember how it started. Well, not from the very beginning, but remember Anchorage, Nissan, it was a huge scene, right? It went viral everywhere where a senior Chinese, basically top Chinese diplomat back then lashed out over the arrogance of the United States. And things kind of went up and down and, until they stabilized during the second half, let's say. But is that process appreciated by people in America? Have they felt, that stability in this relationship actually brings benefit to them?
I think the first point that is important to emphasize is that, especially in Washington, D.C., there is what we often call a bipartisan consensus about being tougher on China. And so any U.S. administration is going to have to reflect that. And certainly the Biden administration, when they came into office, I think, as was demonstrated in that Anchorage meeting, felt it was important to demonstrate to domestic audiences that they were taking that point seriously. At the same time, what the Biden administration did, which I think is one of the real achievements of his presidency, they were able to keep up enough of the competitive actions so that it was hard to criticize them for being, quote unquote, soft on China. But at the same time, they were able to lower the rhetorical temperature around U.S.-China relations. They were able to do both of those things. And I think for many of us who are, observers of U.S.-China relations, we appreciate that they were able to pull off that very complicated balancing. Whether the wider public appreciates it, it's harder for me to tell. And whether the next administration will try to balance the same way, I can't tell. But that, to me, is the achievement of the Biden administration in a very, very complicated landscape.
But really, on a day-to-day basis, for instance, we've seen that trade, for instance, have become has been resilient between the two sides. And, China continues to provide quality and quantity and affordable goods choices for the American consumers. Nissan, do you think that maybe there needs to be an emphasis on keeping that stable instead of, bringing disruptive changes?
Well, certainly, I think what is really interesting about the point you just made is that I agree that in many ways the trade relationship has been stabilized, but the Biden administration never took down the tariffs that the Trump administration had first brought into the picture in a very destabilizing way. And so I think that, again, really reflects the very interesting balancing that the
But people
Biden
are complaining about higher prices, right? Although there's a factor of inflation.
Those are connected, but I think just because of the political landscape here in the United States, it makes sense to me that they were unable to reduce the tariffs. But at the same time, as you said, they were able to create the conditions for a beneficial trade relationship. Whether or not the next administration values that balance, again, is hard for me to say. There's some rhetoric that suggests that maybe they don't, that there will be another round of tariffs.
Yeah,
and that's what I think many of us are expecting.
Well, we'll watch with close eyes on what's going to happen. But Ms. Sanborn, from the economies of the Asia-Pacific region, for instance, what do they expect in terms of trade and economic, of course, overall stability in U.S.-China relations? Are they benefiting from a more stabilized relationship, or are they also bracing for disruptions?
I think we're bracing for disruption. The rhetoric, not only in the campaign, but in these last few days, as the Trump team starts to pull together, the rhetoric is disruptive. The rhetoric is very much confrontational on a number of issues. They've already been making noise about raising tariffs on the rest of us, not just on China. And of course, for countries like ours, Peru, Chile, we have free trade agreements with the United States, and we're beginning to wonder if those agreements will be honored or not. Of course, if the U.S. tries to raise tariffs on some of the other countries that have had good relations with both, it's going to lead us to do more trade with Asia and with China. I mean, that's sort of inevitable.
Well, let's see. Let's see. We don't want to look too much into the crystal ball here and still keeping our positive spirit. But China definitely tried to inject some certainty and predictability in this relationship. President Xi said in Lima, again, as I mentioned, the four unchanged. And I'm going to repeat here because they're a little bit mouthful, that China's goal, for instance, of a stable, healthy and sustainable bilateral ties remains unchanged. China's commitment to mutual respect, peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation as principles remain unchanged. Its position of resolutely safeguarding China's sovereignty, security and developmental interests remains unchanged, and its desire to carry forward the traditional friendship between the Chinese-American peoples remains unchanged. Professor Liu, why is he stressing these 4 points here?
Well, because we are living in a turbulent world, and it is important for China to lay out its basic foundation on which we really engage in relationship. And the three principles have been promoted, and also that's been being accepted and welcomed by most of the members of the global community. And the other is that each country has very different conditions, very different road paths towards their own governance and also their own way of modernization. So therefore, excessive interference into domestic affairs does really lead to destructive effects, and also the distrust will further grow in that regard. So then, to conduct the trade and investment, and we need really mutual respect, and China does not really accept any lectures as to how we can really manage the economic regime and dealing with the rest of the world. I think now, with the upcoming rhetorics from the Trump team, and not only China, but also many other partners, particularly from APEC, they are also getting more prepared to team up closely to guard against the possible slap of tariff and other type of restrictions.
Professor Liu, let me interrupt you here. Sorry. What do you think China is taking away from the past 4 years as what not to do in handling U.S.-China relations? In one sentence, please.
Well, that's the red lines that President Xi has really drawn.
What not to do on China's point?
So
it's a tough one, I know.
I mean, from the China's perspective, that we are not really going to be offering any type of destructive fund, but we do also expect a reciprocal respect from any other party, of course, most outstandingly from the United States, with regard to its governance and also with regard to its own of managing its modernization drive.
All right. Nason, what is the big takeaway from the American side, or from your side personally as an observer to bilateral ties? Because one of the things that we really remember, and most telling to me, is this BBC headline about the so-called spy balloon incident. In the end, this story says the spy balloon did not collect information, says Pentagon. I think this headline deserves to be framed and hung somewhere as a reminder of how hysteria, overreaction can really be not just misleading, but will make oneself a laughing stock. But anyway, that's my take. What is your take, the biggest takeaway, what not to do for the United States?
Well, so I want to make two major points. So the first, and I'm not going to relitigate the spy balloon. That's already very far in the past as far as I'm concerned. I think the first is I'm quite certain that the relationship in the years to come will become more turbulent. And we will look back on this last few years as a period of relative stability. And when we do that, I think a question we can ask ourselves will be, did we get enough out of the period of stability that we should have? Because it will get more turbulent. Did we restore economic ties? Did we restore people-to-people ties? Did we do enough on climate and health? Because all of those things will be harder in the years ahead. So that's one point I want to make. And then the second point is, as things get harder, which they will, I am especially hopeful that the steps we've taken in the last year and a half, 2 years, to restore some basic level of people-to-people exchange will remain. There are lots of other things that will get very turbulent, but I hope that both sides will at least value some degree of people-to-people exchange, so that component,
Okay.
which many of us, including some of us on this call, have tried to restore in the last couple of years, does not go away.
Okay, let's not forget Professor Huang. Professor Huang, sorry for keeping you waiting here. What really has to be in mind as we enter the next 4 years? It seems there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unease, but aren't we better prepared knowing that we already lived the first 4 years under President Trump?
Sure, I think there will be a lot of uncertainties and turbulence with Donald Trump comes into power. But if anything that, or lessons that both sides can learn that, for example, China never took any confrontational approach towards the United States, always approach the United States in a kind of cooperative or manageable way. That does not mean that China is afraid of any confrontation. China is not. Actually, China already laid out some red line. That means
Right.
China's red lines cannot be crossed. But in the years to come, I think China is still maintained, as we know, a very open-minded openness towards the outside world. Of course, Donald Trump administration may do some very terrible or harsh way against China, but does not mean that the entire world will do the same. China will be more open and more friendly, more approachable towards all the other countries, including those in the Asian Pacific, because if history can tell us anything, that, for example, 2001, we had two major trade agreements signed. One is the NAFTA, which goes nowhere mainly because United States behavior. But another one is a 10+1 China side free trade agreement with ASEAN. Look where the ASEAN is. I mean, it's a win-win situation. The economy in this area, both in China and the 10 member countries of ASEAN, increased tremendously. I think China will just follow the same route, that is open to others and also try others who are open to China. I think strike a win-win cooperation.
Professor Huang,
and equal, of course.
Professor Huang, you did mention China laid out the 4 red lines, and I want to ask you this. The 4 red lines, namely Taiwan, which is very clear, it's repeated many times, and then China mentioned democracy and human rights, China's path and systems, and its development interests. Why do you think China mentions democracy and human rights this time? This is clearly for President Trump and his team.
Yes, I think that democracy is a kind of, not only kind of value, but also way of governance. Every country and every nation has its own right to choose the democracy they practice in the way they think fit their country best. I think democracy is not somebody's privilege or somebody's monopoly, and should not be defined by only one country or government. And worst of all is that should not be lecture others how to do the same quote-unquote democracy.
Okay.
So same with human rights. I mean, it's a common value. I mean, everybody wants human rights. Everybody wants to practice the best way they govern their own society. So when China mentioned democracy and human rights, it's also cross-line. Basically means please do not tell us, do not lecture us. Do not what democracy is. Do not define democracy the way you want. It is not your monopoly. I think that's the line is very clear here.
Okay, Ms. Sanborn, how do you read these 4 red lines, especially the second one I just mentioned?
Democracy and human rights. Yeah. Well, I'd like to read it in a slightly different perspective, because although we could see this as kind of historical differences between the United States and China on what, as the professor said, what rights are primary and how each nation and culture decides their priorities. And the U.S. has put a lot of emphasis on political and even religious liberty, and China on cultural, social, economic rights. But I think China's language on human rights has changed in our part of the world. Coming from the developing world, the global south, we're seeing the Chinese talk about the respect for human rights when their companies are overseas, when they're investing in new societies. We've seen a lot more language coming from China about respecting human rights elsewhere where they're operating. And we think that's encouraging. And we do hope that the message will remain with the new U.S. administration as well, that has to be respected.
Let's definitely keep a close watch on that as well. A lot of things to watch out for. But G20 is around the corner, and President Xi actually has already arrived in Brazil, and he has published an article about China-Brazil ties. And this year's theme is building a just world and sustainable planet. Nissan, is that talked about? Is that going to be an important item on the agenda of the upcoming U.S. administration?
I think it's not too hard to predict that the new administration in the U.S. will not approach the problem of climate change in the way that the last administration did. For those of us who believe that climate is the existential crisis of our time, that is disappointing. And it is an opportunity, frankly, for China to play a leadership role, as the rhetoric that you just indicated suggests that it could. I think this is very much an opportunity for China. Whether or not China, takes that opportunity is an open question to me, but certainly we know that the U.S. at the national level is not going to be as active in the arena of combating climate change as the last administration was.
Professor Liu, is that what the Chinese is thinking about the G20, for instance, using this potentially as an opportunity to increase its influence? Because it's the U.S. decision whether to engage with the bloc or not.
I think you're absolutely right, because China never really imposed its own agenda onto the global either trading platform or other climate change issues. So it is, yes, the U.S., the upcoming administration that is going to even withdraw from the climate change treaty and also to revert more to the fossil-based energy. So therefore, China is not really there to proactively grasp such a sort of leadership. It's grown on a natural basis because, for one, China has the largest economy, and we are going forward, even if it is an uphill battle for the high-quality development. So China is already de facto taking the leadership in generating the new batteries, the solar panels, wind powers, and e-vehicles, etc. So the U.S. finds it's going to be more challenging, and therefore they put a preemptive tariff against the Chinese. All type of e-equipments to be imported into the U.S. But now they should really reflect that why they should leave such a sort of future-oriented model of development to the other countries, and like China.
So, yeah, well, the key words, there have been ups, there have been downs, but I think China has matured as well. I hope this is going to be, with the incoming U.S. administration doing it the second time, that let's handle this with maturity and responsibility for ourselves and for the rest of the world. Many thanks to my guests. I have to leave it there. Professor Huang Jing on the line from Shanghai International Studies University, Nissan Mahboubi, Director of PEN Project of the Future of U.S.-China Relations at University of Pennsylvania, Cynthia Sanborn, Director of Center for China and Asia Pacific Studies at the University of Pacific, if I say that, Universidad del Pacifico, if I say it right, and Professor Liu Baochen.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As usual, follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for joining us. You've got The Point.